Matt, we have a very special guest in person from the other side of the Atlantic. Oh, don't worry, we don't use the video.
Oh, cool. Okay.
And we're here to talk about a very special topic, which I will be coming back to it. The patrons, I hear you. You want more of it, and we're talking about American freak shows because
give the people what they want. Give the people what they want.
In the continuity of tattoo history, American freak shows and American sideshows is super important, and it's a kind of an intertwined history. And to understand more about the history of freak shows, we are joined by esteemed labor journalist and freak show enthusiast Kim Kelly. Kim, say hello to everyone.
Hello. I love that introduction. Freak show enthusiast just really has a great ring to it, and it could go so many different ways.
I mean, anyone who has formed a parasocial relationship with me and Matt through this show is a freak enthusiast, so we love you all.
Well, then I'm right
Speak
at
for
home.
yourself, Thomas.
So, Matt, where do we start with the history of freak shows as it pertains to tattoos?
Well, I don't know, I think freak shows is a sort of interesting word in a way, because it's a subset of something bigger, right, which is the kind of sideshow. And of course, the sideshow, what's it on the side of? It's on the side of circuses. So the sideshow is basically the stuff, traditionally, although, it would develop into being something of its own thing, but the sideshow is the stuff around the circus, so the stuff that you do before the circus show started, right? So circus would roll into town. This is, from the mid-19th century onwards, I suppose. We have essentially, right, the circus happening, all this performance, and then around it you have all kinds of other things to keep people busy and keep people spending money. So that is fortune tellers. That is kind of carnival games, these words like carny and things get used. So people having these kind of sideshow games. And then you have, which is, I suppose, where the kind of freak show idea develops from, you have these, basically kind of curiosities, I suppose. Come and see the strange and wild things. And they're often, they're often kind of human oddities. So people with disabilities, they're often really quite problematically, and this is probably where the tattoo stuff comes in, first of all, with linked with things like, look at the strange people from some other places, look at the pygmies, look at these strange savages from the deepest, darkest jungles of wherever. And all of this kind of Victorian interest in, we talked about in the podcast before, like things like physiognomy, how we as white Europeans are related culturally and evolutionarily to places around the world. That all gets kind of built in with language of sideshows and freak shows. It's around the same time. It's weirdly this kind of mix of science and entertainment. I mean, those ideas go back probably even to the 18th century, but I think probably with what we're talking about, particularly in the US context, it's like early decades, mid decades of the 19th century onwards.
Yeah, and what we're looking at as well is that in the continuity of freak shows and sideshows, there is two different really distinctions. There are natural freaks and then there are made freaks.
There's three.
Oh, there's three.
There are three levels in the hierarchy.
Okay, Kim, weigh in. School me, tell me.
And this is something that, you come across a lot if you just read about this stuff. It's also something that was laid out very clearly to me when I went to sideshow school, because that's something that I did. We can talk more about that later, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there are three distinct levels of, I suppose, the hierarchy or the pyramid. And at the top, not to brag, are the natural born freaks,
mm-hmm.
who were people that were born different. And they're people that were disabled, people like me that have specific congenital deformities or different conditions that are looked different through no fault or through no, effort of their own. That's just kind of how we showed up.
For the visual learners, Kim has a third arm coming out of her back.
I wish I had that many fingers. No, I just for context, I have this. I don't want to say condition because it's not that big a deal, but I have this this thing called ectrodactyly. You might have heard it described as lobster claw syndrome. I'm not affected that much, but so just for people listening at home, my left arm is smaller and I've got like 3 fingers and I've got a very like claw-like appearance, which is like very metal. And it's just kind of part of my deal. But people like me would be regarded as sideshow royalty in a way in this specific hierarchy. So that's the natural borns. And then below are the self-made freaks, people with tattoos and piercings, lizard boys, alligator girls, people that like decided I'm going to look different for fun and profit, essentially. Like if you see someone like the Enigma or the Lizard Man, people who have tattooed everything. That's kind of where I think tattooing really sits. And then at the bottom, which is kind of a real inversion of, I guess, the rest of the world hierarchy, right? The bottom are just the working acts. So your fire breathers, sword swallowers, glass walkers, people that are just acquire a special skill, and that's what they use to perform and to kind of ply their trade.
Yeah, that's your strong men, that's your that kind of thing.
Yeah, the diving girls, the trap, like it's the more circusy acts, I suppose.
And also the secret fourth thing as well, which is the gaff.
Oh yeah.
So this is people who are essentially faking their act. So this is like, you know, legless wonders who have their like feet, you know, tucked up behind their back, or like armless wonders who like they have their arm inside their tunic, or they're faking either a natural deformity and being a, you know, born freak, or they are kind of cheating the performance as well. This is like sword swallowers who have like folding swords that collapse, you know.
So cheating.
Yeah,
the real version hurts so much.
I think like it's probably. I was just gonna just read a bit from this book called Hubert's Freaks by Gregory Gibson. Do you know this book?
That's a good one.
So this is a book by Gregory Gibson, which is the story of a particular kind of sideshow freak show from New York, from Coney Island. But the opening chapter, or the opening section, I'm just going to read you a bit of it because it sort of sets up the history quite nicely of what we're talking about here, right? So this is directly from Gibson. In 1831, a Yankee sea captain named Benjamin Morrill captured 2 cannibals in the South Pacific and brought them back to America. For the next few years, he displayed them throughout the northeastern United States at places like New York City's American Museum. He wrote a book about his adventures, and his wife, who accompanied him on his voyage, wrote her own account, which verified his. The 2 savages, named Sunday and Monday, in honor of the days in which they were captured, astonished American audiences. Captain Morrell wrote, in the year of 1830, they were cannibals. In the year of 1832, they are civilized, intelligent men. And he goes on to say, none of Morrell's fellow mariners were fooled. They called him the biggest liar in the Pacific. His foe cannibals were probably just domesticated Pacific Islanders or African American impersonators posing as savages to astonish white American rubes. They're among the earliest examples of such. Right. So this is kind of what we're talking about. And with tattooing, that kind of boundary between fantasy and reality is really present. So some of the earliest examples, you know, are people like John Rutherford, right? John Rutherford, this Englishman who claims to have been captured by Maoris and who claims to have, you know, basically survived amongst the Maori by getting his face tattooed. He became known as like the White Chief.
Lies.
Yeah, well, it turns out even at the time, this is like in the 1820s, like even at the time, this Reverend, funny enough, writes this article going, I don't think the boat he says he was on ever existed. Like, if you were going to get that kind of facial tattooing against your will, like you wouldn't be able to sit still. No Maori chief would give a white guy this kind of tattooing, you know, of social status. Like, the whole story is nonsense, but he manages to make quite a good living for a while, and sells a book and performs at in England, not quite, we wouldn't really call them sideshows, we'd call them kind of music hall acts or things like that. And so, like, really early on, like the history of tattooing and these sideshows becomes intertwined with this idea of like, oh my god, savages. And in fact, with what you were saying, Kim, I think that the story about the self-made freaks is really interesting because that story kind of becomes a bit old hat by the early 20th century. People have sort of seen it, and the world's a bit more known in the era of photography and in the era of kind of, you know, post World War One with steamships and travel. These kind of stories of savages in the jungle aren't so exciting anymore. And actually, someone like the great Omi, who also gets his face tattooed with big, heavy black tattooing in the 1920s. He does that because, like, he initially tries out a kind of I was captured in the jungle story and no one really cares. And so then it becomes a kind of, why the hell would you do that to yourself pitch.
Shout out to Oh My, who owed George Burchett so much money.
So much money. I mean, the story's a bit more fuzzy than that, but basically, like, when the stories of the natural freaks, certainly in terms of tattooing, become boring, the self-made freaks become even more interesting because, like, it becomes a much more interesting human interest story of, like, why would you do that to yourself? What kind of crazy person are you?
Yeah, and it becomes like a real kind of contextual measure of extremity of, like, people aren't used to seeing, people who are heavily pierced or heavily tattooed, and it is when the wider world has been explained away by actual science, then that's what becomes the real curiosity. But I was going to ask him, you mentioned being in, circus school and your time in the circus. Can you tell me about, like, what led you on that path and what it was like actually working in the circus?
Sure, and I don't want to. Well, man, at first I was gonna jump in and mention Olive Oatman. But
oh yeah,
do you know about her?
Of course, yeah.
Well, of course, you're tattoo historians. Of course you do.
I don't think our audience. I don't think we've spoken about Olive Oatman on the podcast. So you can mention her story because hers is a kind of opposite story to Rutherford's, right?
Yeah, it's just a quick side note because I think it's interesting. There was this woman named Olive Oatman. This was during the I can't remember the exact time period because it all kind of bleeds together into a whole just sort of orgy of genocide in my country. But just during the
it's like late 19th century, I think, when her story's happening.
Yeah, basically a woman whose family was heading west. Go west, young man. Manifest destiny. All that. She was captured by members of an indigenous tribe, and she lived with them, and they tattooed her face, blue tattoos on her chin, right around her mouth, very visible. And she was eventually returned to white civilization. And whether or not she really wanted that to happen, whether or not she felt like that's where she belonged after spending an extended period with the members of that tribe, that's still kind of up for historical debate. But she ended up it stuck back in white society, and there wasn't a lot that she could do about her appearance, and that was incredibly shocking in the Victorian era. This white woman who had blue face tattoos, and so she ended up having to exhibit herself kind of on the freak show circuit for a while, which she hated. She was just a lady, like she wasn't trying to.
There's a really good book about her story by Margot Mifflin, which is worth
the
reading.
Girl with the Blue Tattoo.
The Girl with the Blue Tattoo. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That's what I'm pulling from. I just always think it's an interesting because just part of little piece of that history because it's the intersection of sideshow and colonialism and just all of these things. And also just hearing about it just kind of dovetails with the idea that so many people who took part in the freak show didn't really want to, or just economic or social necessity that put them there.
Yeah, and I think in between the kind of Rutherfords of the world in the early decades of the 19th century and then Omi in the early decades of the 20th century, you've also got, which is sort of the period that Oatman crosses over with a bit, you have these performing largely tattooed women. There were some performing tattooed men as well, although they very quickly became not very interesting to audiences. The performing tattooed women, again, part of it was, as you said, Kim, a kind of prurience at the self-made freaks. So you have people like Emma de Berg in particular, and her husband Frank, who's also a tattooed man. You have Tom Riley's wife, Flo Riley, like lots of women who actually were married to tattoo artists, funnily enough. And they're getting tattooed heavily in the aftermath of the encounter with Japan, often with this very extensive kind of beautiful Japanese work. Flo Riley in London is described in the 1880s as like, the living gallery of Japanese art. But again, it's an excuse to go. In the US, you'd be going to a Barnum and Bailey, a Ringling Brothers kind of circus. In the UK, you might be going to the Royal Aquarium. But it's basically a good excuse to see a woman with not many clothes. Seeing a woman with not many clothes on.
There wasn't a huge amount of entertainment back in the Victorian era. It was either go to the aquarium to see a naked woman or smoke opium.
Yeah, or both at the same time. But
right,
I think those kind of intersections, right, between the kind of the kind of medical, scientific, and the prurient, and the exotic, and the sexy are all like really intertwined. Just lastly, the other really important name to throw out here while we're throwing out names is a guy called Captain Kostanensis, who's an Albanian guy, and he's like probably the first big famous performing tattooed man. He works in circuses and sideshows and music halls and theatres across Europe, including in England and in America. He's a Greek Albanian guy. He's covered in these tattoos that are, at least he claims to have had them done in Burma. He spins all these wild tales about being captured, like he helped lead a revolt of mine workers against the Chinese occupiers of Burma. Like but he becomes this kind of medical curiosity. So he's like, he gets inspected by scientists, and like, oh, I think these are real. These tattoos are definitely real, and he becomes this huge famous circus performer. And the story shifts over the decades depending on what's fashionable and what's exciting, but in all of these tales, like this mash together of colonial European expansionism, Orientalism in that broad sense of like foreigners are weird, the sexualization of that as well, all comes together. And I think there's not much on TV in the 19th century, right? Because TV hasn't been invented yet. So this is what you got. This is the kind of performing arts equivalent of Channel 4 or something. Channel 5.
Yeah, the Victorians didn't have Seinfeld or Curb Your Enthusiasm, so they got to do something else. But I want to bring back my original question.
Sorry. And that kind of, that does kind of, after even just talking a little bit about the problematic and cruel and nasty parts of sideshow history, it's like, why would someone who has a choice, who is disabled, want to get involved with that now, knowing everything we know? And I just sort of no one just falls into sideshow school. You have to go find it. There's only really one place that does it. But I ended up going to sideshow school at Coney Island, which is obviously, Coney Island is just this incredibly historic site for the sideshow and the circus and live entertainment.
And for tattooing.
And for tattooing and for human zoos, just every interesting historical entertainment related moment has probably gone through Coney Island. Mm-hmm. But also that's where my partner's from. So I spent a lot of time in Coney Island anyway. And we used to go on dates to the Coney Island sideshow because I was interested, because I'm a history nerd and I've been interested in this stuff for a while anyway. But he just mentioned offhand one day, oh yeah, I think they used to do a sideshow school here. And I was like, sideshow? You can go and learn how to do this stuff? I thought it was like how tattooing used to be. You had to just know someone and work your way up, and it wasn't allowed to share the knowledge. But it turns out you pay some money and a guy will teach you how to do everything.
Turns out tattooing is like that too.
Yeah, it's wild how things change. I mean, it's and since I'm a journalist, I thought to myself, okay, this is kind of an interesting story, right? Like a real life lobster girl goes to sideshow school. And at first I went into it thinking like, okay, this will be a cool feature. Like I'll sell this to a magazine, whatever. I'll write about it. It'll be fun. I didn't really expect to connect with it as deeply as I ended up doing. And it was really during the first couple moments of sitting there with the 9 other students, because it's only about 10 people. And it's led by Adam Reelman, who is just an icon in Coney Island modern history. He's the professor in his Brooklyn-ass accent. And he was just giving a quick little rundown of sideshow history and talking about freaks and talking about natural borns and born difference and everything. And he went around the room and said, does anyone here qualify as a natural born? Not expecting anyone to raise their hand. But then I did. And it turns out I'm the first person in the history of that program to have been a natural born, to have showed up and gone to sideshow school. So just seeing their reaction to that, really, it did something to me. Right? Because when you grow up with a visible and sort of rare physical deformity, for lack of a better word, it's complicated, right? It's not something that you necessarily, or at least not something I necessarily really waved around. I kept my hands in my pockets a lot when I was growing up and when I was younger. It was just something I didn't really want to deal with because it wasn't a big deal to me, but it seemed like it's a pretty big deal to people that would spot it and be like, what's going on with you?
It's
not a conversation you necessarily want to have all the time. It's like, oh my God, what's up with your tattoos or what's up with your piercings? But like forever, and you can't really, you didn't get a choice. But anyway, I went through the sideshow school process, learned how to breathe and eat fire and walk on glass and swallow swords, which is so hard. I'm still not very good at it. Hammer a nail on my face, do feats of strength. Set off a mousetrap on my tongue. Played with a snake for a little bit. Just kind of all the classics. Girl in a box, breaking concrete on my stomach on a bed of nails. And it's all the thing with sideshow acts is it's real. It's not like magic. Like it's a very physical. You're doing these things. There's specific ways that you have to do it so you don't, puncture a lung or set yourself on fire or get chemical burns in your lungs like someone I know did because she learned off YouTube and not from a professional.
Breathing fire, much like tattooing, do not learn it off YouTube.
Please don't, because you could die it's so easy to die. They really hammered that home. And I went through that. Yeah.
Don't take sword swallowing advice from a podcast.
Oh my gosh, yeah, please find, that's one of the kind of things where like, you gotta find a guy that knows.
You gotta find a guy.
Do you know the story, Kim, of the Cleppy Bells?
Cleppy Bells. It sounds vaguely familiar.
So these are your forebears, right? With kind of lobster clawed people. So again, reading from a book here. This is from Armand Leroy's book Mutants, which I really like.
Oh, that's a good one.
So in this book, he talks about all kinds of things that are kind of deformities and. Portrayal of people with interesting physiognomies. Anyway, this is about the Cleppy Bells. So, in the old Scottish dialect, to clep is to call, and partens are crabs. Call down among the crabs and be drowned. This girl had been executed, and the executor said, "Clep down among the partens and be drowned." And as recently as 1900, a family bearing the names of Bell and possessing hands moulded from birth into a claw-like deformity lived in the southeast of Scotland and was said to be dependent of the Cleppy Bells. So a man named Bell after he'd done his cruel work being an executioner, so he was an executioner, his wife gave birth to a child who bore the ineradicable mark of his father's guilt. Instead of its fingers, its hands bore claws like a crab. The bairn is clept, said the midwife. The marks of Bell's judicial crime would be visited on his dependents, many of whom would bear the deformity. They would be known as Cleppy Bells. So this executioner executed basically this innocent young woman, and God smited him and his descendants with claw hands.
That's fun.
So a
little teratology for you.
There's this whole sort of storytelling, and those are the kind of things which would be great to get the people in, right? The carnival barker, the posters, everything would kind of advise people that this was going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the American equivalent would be the Styles family, right? Grady Styles and his descendants. I think I'm friends with his grandson on Facebook, which is kind of wild if you think about how close that history is. Oh gosh, but I'm all over the place. But I think there's that moment of just kind of the light bulb switching in my head of okay, this is something I have to deal with. Wow, in this specific community, in this specific context, this is like a gift. I am winning this. I'm winning the sideshow because I have this specific physiology, whatever,
physiology. Yeah,
there you go. It sounds better coming out of your mouth.
But it's really interesting, doing the research for the Sideshow series that we're doing on Patreon and reading a lot of personal letters and diaries from people who were involved in sideshow acts. And it seems like, particularly when I've seen stuff from people who are in their mid-teenage years, particularly ones with, born physical deformities, it seems like there's this real community of understanding that everyone's kind of in this together, and whether you're a barker or you're a fire breather or you're someone who might be missing some limbs or some other physical ailment, that there's really a place of belonging and understanding, and it's that all exists before you get to the next town, you get on the stage, and then you're faced with what the general public kind of sees you as, and it creates that interesting in-group and out-group between people who are in the culture versus people who are viewers of the culture.
Yeah, gobble gobble, one of us, that's the thing, because it is such a specific, and I think in many ways insular culture even now, like it's such it's not a dying art, but it's definitely a diminished art. Like live entertainment in and of itself has definitely changed a lot since its heyday. But the sideshow has it does have that sort of prurient, kind of problematic kind of stench to it, depending on who you are and how you feel about disability and how you feel about live performance and just where you fall on that sort of like a strata of opinions. Because I when I was writing the article about Sideshow, I reached out, I interviewed people, folks from other disability associations that were not big fans. They were like, this is, it used to be, it's like a source of pain for our community. We used to be exhibited like animals. Like, this is not something necessarily to celebrate, but we also understand that some people in our community want to kind of reclaim that for themselves, and we understand that too. Like, it's complicated, right? And I've spoken to other sideshow performers who are disabled about this, and there's such a sense of pride in the people I've spoken to who are also natural borns, who have found space in the sideshow and in live performance. And I think it's important for us to hold on to that piece of our history, right? And to do that, have that reclamation, and to also understand like just how deeply fucked up that history is and grapple with it. But we can't, it's part of our history, right? We can't just let it be taken away because it makes some people uncomfortable.
Obviously the kind of like urtext of this conversation in a way is Tom Browning's Freaks film, right? Which so much of it is horribly exploitative, and it's been kind of hauled over by film theorists and by disability scholars and historians for a long time. But I think like in amongst, I don't know how much of the writing about that film you've read, Kim, but my sense is that like even in the kind of grotesqueness of that movie, there is something of what you're talking about, right? Which is this kind of group identity and this sense of belonging. I mean, it has all this potentially kind of eugenicist stuff in it, and again, I think people have come, particularly who come from a more, probably more proximate position to it, see it actually as in the way that you're talking about, and seeing the freaks, so to speak, as represented in that film, as exactly as you're talking, like as a community of people who are brought together in common cause, right? And I don't know what you make of that movie, because I think it's such a good. I think it's the discussion around the film sort of mirrors some of the discussions around the histories that you're talking about more generally, right?
I love that movie so much.
Right, this is what I mean.
I think it's really beautiful. I mean, obviously, yeah, it's something that can be dissected, and there's nuance, and of course, I'm not a blanket endorsement, sure, but there's so many scenes that are just so humanizing. You see people who are labeled as freaks, who are disabled, who look different. Like, you see people having crushes on each other and standing up for one another and looking out for their homies and breaking bread and having inside jokes and performing and giggling. Like, it's just, I think one of the reasons that so many people were so shocked and appalled and horrified is because it reminded them that sideshow freaks, as they branded us, that we're people just like them. And I think people could not handle thinking of us that way, thinking about Daisy and Violet Hilton and their love affairs, or Prince Randy and having a smoke. Like, we're just like you. We just came out a little different, and nobody goes out the way they come in. So you never know what happens between birth and death.
And I think it's an interesting thing that, like, me and Matt have talked about it a lot when it comes to tattooing, is that like when you have like any kind of community that is viewed as kind of an outgroup by wider society, people on the outside tend to view it as monolithic, that like everyone kind of thinks the same way, and we think about this one way, and then everyone else is like on the outside and doesn't really understand it. But it is like that, there is quote unquote discourse around something like Freaks, that like people who are in the community think differently from people who are outside the community, but they also think differently from each other.
Yeah, it's even the word freak itself, right? Like, where I feel like people tiptoe around it a little bit in these discussions. But even back when Annie Jones, the bearded lady, was trying to get people to stop using it, I've spoken to people recently in the community who are like, "Oh, I'm a freak. I'm a proud freak. That's a mantle that I wear because of the history and because I'm not like everyone else. I don't want to be." Even the term itself, it's not. I mean, I'm not going to get into the bigger issue of political and identity groups reclaiming names for themselves, because that's a little above my pay grade, right? But in this specific instance, I kind of like the idea of being a sideshow freak. It's not something but it's also not something that I would like just some guy in the street come up and see me and be like, oh, you're like a sideshow freak. Like, you don't get to say that, but I can say that, you know?
That's when you start swinging at them. Matt, do you have any questions before you have to go?
Well, I want to say, the status of tattooing within the contemporary sideshow I'd be interested in, because again, like, what was interesting, again, in terms of these kind of issues of perception, right, is that certainly in the British, I think this is true in Germany too, but certainly in the British and American sideshows, like, they were quite good markets for tattoo artists. And in Britain at the Aquarium, Tom Riley, for example, and Alfred South, like, would set up their tattoo booths, and there was even like conflict over who got the pitch because it was very lucrative. People could come and see the tattooed ladies or the tattooed men, and they could then go home with a tattoo. And in the US, again, people like Frank Howard and his wife Annie, who were like these really famous, important tattoo performers in the late 19th century, worked for Barnum. They became like tattoo artists, or Frank became a tattoo artist himself. He ran a tattoo shop in Boston. He sold tattoo equipment. And like, it's really interesting that not only, as a viewer, you can go and kind of gawp, and I'm sure a huge percentage of the viewership of sideshows and circuses would say, I'm glad I'm not like them. That's part of the thrill. But for some people, and maybe this is particularly true of the tattooing, people are like, that's cool. I want to get in on that, right? And so that thing really interests me. And I know that the kind of contemporary sideshow, the rebirth of the contemporary sideshow with the Jim Rose Circus, and you mentioned Enigma and Eric Sprague, Lizard Man, they've sort of deliberately, and I think Circus of Horrors to some degree in the UK as well, like, they've deliberately played with this intersection with subculture and tattooing in a way that has parodied and engaged with and quite celebrated those subcultural histories in some really interesting ways. I mean, we should also probably, Tom, get Eric Sprague, Lizard Man, on. He's a super interesting figure in his own right. Walking through Camden is a real treat with him. Guy's tatted green. But I wonder, Kim, like, what's my sense is that there's a real closeness now with the modern sideshow, circus, burlesque world and tattooing, right?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I go to tattoo conventions once in a while because maybe there's artists in town I want to see. Maybe I just want to go be around. It's funny, I would say my people, but tattoo culture is so varied and so not monolithic. It's not always my people. Like, yeah. I'm not a big affliction guy, but and that's in the US, but it's something that, like, whenever you go to a tattoo convention, at least in the US, there's also people doing suspension. Right. There's also burlesque. There's also a fire eater. There's sometimes you'll see a freak show not as it maybe not billed as such, but you'll see some oddities. You'll see some gaffes, like some taxidermied stuff, or you'll see like some things in jars. Like, it's all sort of kind of crunched together as like, this is alt kind of spooky culture, and then there's just tattooers everywhere. Like, it's been very kind of pushed together into this just sort of general alternative culture. And maybe some of that does go back to Jim Rose in the 90s when you had, people with a lot of piercings and tattoos doing this in a very bombastic way, kind of doing this modern freak show thing. But it's funny because I think there's still a line, like a woman that I performed with at Coney Island, Insectivora, the world's most partially illustrated woman. That's her tagline. She has a lot of tattoos, and she has very distinct and bold facial tattoos. But she's also like a brilliant fire eater, and she can do all the classics, and that's what she does on stage. But it's still like people to come take photos with her. She's very, like, it's part of her whole deal. And she's told me before, I interviewed her for an article earlier in the pandemic when I spoke to sideshow performers and circus artists, like, what are you doing to survive? And she just told me how difficult it was for her to find employment, because once you modify your body to that extent, you're still... sure, a lot of people have nice sleeves. People even have cute little face tattoos. You could go anywhere in Dalston and get like a little like white ink rose on your temple, but it's not the same. as getting massive tribal markings on
Right.
your face
Yeah,
or
yeah.
becoming a lizard. I think that line is still there, and I don't know if we'll ever get past it,
I
but
don't
it
think
is
we will. I
interesting.
mean, Omi is such a good example of that, because he came out of World War One and was broke. Like, he tried to run a chicken farm and couldn't. Went bankrupt. He tried to make money as a tattooed man, just of the conventional kind, and no one gave a shit. So then he got all these crazy, heavy black work on his face and became the Zebra Man and this human monster, and made a good living at that. But that was it. So what I mean, and then that story kind of, as I said, ran out of road, and he ended up then sharpening his teeth and having a big septum ring. His wife got involved. But eventually, yeah, he sort of ran out of road as well, and he retired to a caravan park in Dorset, but had quite a hard retirement because he's got a heavily tattooed black face in the 1940s. So I think, yeah, that story is exactly right. Where people were pushing at boundaries because that's the way to make money and that's the way to live their lives. But that's hard on your body, hard on your life.
Yeah, and what happens when that industry goes away, temporarily or forever?
Everyone knows that tattoo aftercare is one of the most important steps in getting a new tattoo. We all want our fresh new tattoos to heal as easily and hassle-free as possible so we can show them off to the world.
That's why Sanoderm's here to help. Driven by science and innovation, Sanoderm products have been thoroughly tested and used by doctors and tattoo artists alike for over 10 years.
Sanoderm brings cutting-edge technology to make your tattoo healing process a breeze. No more messing around with cleaning and plastic every few hours with Sanoderm's amazing range of aftercare products. I personally have used Sanoderm to heal my tattoos in the past, and they made what used to be a daily process of setting reminders on my phone to clean and rewrap my tattoo into a one-step process.
Their medical-grade products include aftercare balms, soaps, and my favourite, their second skin aftercare bandages. Sanoderm's tattoo bandages are designed to be waterproof, breathable, and keep your new tattoo protected from whatever the elements can throw at it, so you can get on with your day, worry-free, and confident your new tattoo will look vibrant and will heal faster.
Plus, their products are all natural and ethically sourced, so you can take comfort in knowing that you're healing your tattoos with nature's finest ingredients.
So next time you're in an artist's chair, why not try Sanoderm, healing your tattoos the modern way so you can get on with your day.
Check out the link in the description of this episode for discounts on a range of Sanoderm products or for more information. Hey, are you enjoying the show? If you really like Beneath the Skin and you want to help support us, you can do so on Patreon. For little as £5 a month, you can help make this show possible, help us buy research materials. So if you like the show and you want to support us, consider kicking us a few quid a month. And you'll get everything from bonus episodes to Q&As, and you can even vote on what tattoo I'll get when we reach a certain subscriber count. Matt, have you got anything to say?
You should really definitely fund the Patreon because tattoo history is massive, right? Deep, wide, complicated. We're covering some big hit topics on the main feed, but on the Patreon subscriber-only feed, we'll be getting into some really more interesting, niche, deep topics you don't want to miss out on. And honestly, the chance to kind of decide what Thomas gets on his body is probably just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Subscribe, chuck us a few quid. Don't miss out on this chance to ruin Thomas's body forever.
So, one thing that is very important now that Matt has left and we're falling into my semi-area of expertise and your area of actual expertise is we're going to talk about the labour relations for the next 20 minutes, because obviously one thing that's very important when talking about the sideshow and freak show industry is how they related to each other in terms of like who was actually making money and who was performing. And like you said earlier in the episode, there is this relationship between like people who out of economic necessity would be involved in sideshows, and then there'd be people running the show who might be making disproportionately too much money off performers. So can you tell me a little bit about the labor relations in early, sideshows and freak shows, and what it was like going into the evolution of late stage capitalism as sideshows begin to peter out in the 1980s?
God, so I was so excited to be able to kind of sneak Sideshows into my book, which is for people listening at home. It's called Fight Like Hell, The Untold History of American Labor. And there's a whole chapter on disabled workers. And so me being me and having experience I had, I was like, okay, well, the Sideshow obviously makes sense to include, not just because I'm a freak show enthusiast, but because for a good amount of time, that was the only employment available to people who had physical disabilities that were deemed exotic or interesting or horrific.
Yeah.
You know, you couldn't just go down the mines or go work in a factory because, I mean, at that point in time, people were still not, I mean, they're not great now, but back then they were not accepting. There were not physical, there were not accommodations for people who were disabled. You were just a burden or a freak or a mistake. Like you're not really regarded as a person who was human unless you happen to have a family that would care for you and take you in, or who could afford to send you to a nicer sort of institution, or you would end up in a worse institution or end up in the workhouse. There weren't a lot of options.
Yeah.
And the history of the Sideshow in terms of as far as we see it as a place of work, I think there's two ways to look at it. First, there's people that chose to work there that made agreements with people like P.T. Barnum. If we think about General Tom Thumb, Charlie Stratford, for example, his parents decided, okay, we're going to have him work for this man. And Charlie grew up and became famous, and he toured the world and he made millions. He saved P.T. Barnum from bankruptcy. He met the Queen. He had a great time. His wife, Lavinia Warren, same deal. Like, they probably had the best possible working life you could have as a disabled person at that time. But then you contrast things like that, people that chose to join up, who were paid a wage, who made the choice and gave consent to exhibit themselves and to have that be their place of work, with people that were forcibly sold into it and enslaved or coerced. Like, I think all the time about the example of Julia Pastrana, who the time, when she was working, she was known as alternately like the dog-faced woman, the ape-faced woman, the what is it. Really, there's so many really ugly strains of just racism and xenophobia and sexism and just every possible ism you can think of, right? This woman had to endure during her lifetime as a working artist and just as a human being. She was a person that she was basically sold to this man who became her manager, who then became her husband and dictated everything about her life. She was an accomplished singer and dancer. She spoke multiple languages, but because of her condition, she was covered in hair. She had a different, an atypical appearance. She was an indigenous woman from Mexico. All these reasons that the public in the UK and in the US thought she was exotic and weird and gross and different. Like, she was exhibited all over the country and exploited by this manager. It's thought, I haven't done a ton of research in this specifically. It's thought that she was compelled to, at one point, labor as a sex worker because her manager decided that's what she was going to do. And after she died, her body and the body of her child, who had the same condition she did, were taxidermied and then exhibited throughout the world again and ended up in storage in Norway until somebody found it. And she was eventually repatriated in like the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And there's so many different stories and so many different ways that someone can take part in the Sideshow. And it's important to just pay attention to how that is all manifested. It wasn't just, running away to join the circus, but not every performer was exploited to that extent or treated in such an inhumane way. Like someone like Johnny Eck, who people might have seen him in Freaks. He's just this dashing gentleman who billed himself as the half man. He had a great career. But there's also people like, even going back to Sarah Bartman, she was exhibited on the Freak Show service. She was an African woman. She wasn't a freak. She was just an African woman from a specific tribe that had specific physical characteristics. But her case, her career in the Sideshow has sort of become almost a cautionary tale of how racism and colonialism, misogynoir, all of these horrible oppressive structures can compound into one person's short, miserable life.
Yeah. And it's like, I think it's really interesting as well to think about not just like the necessity, but the kind of compounding fact of, not every performer is going to be a star, and that there was stratums of the more severe the deformity, or the more extreme the act, the higher kind of draw rate they had for people coming to look at them. And you had this case of these people who, either through disability or some other circumstance, could not exist economically in the outside world, and being kind of finding this kind of employment that suited them. But also, we never hear about all of the performers that weren't, Tom Thumb.
Right. I've done a ton of research into this just because I'm interested in hearing about who else was involved, especially women. That's, I guess, my special interest, disabled women. And hopefully I'll write a book about that if I can convince someone to let me publish it. But even just in terms of desirability, right? Or what we might call pretty privilege, just how the juxtaposition of someone who is conventionally attractive or that people find beautiful, but who also has a physical disability or a physical appearance that is different and unique. You add in that sexualization. You add in these other layers. For example, you think of Daisy and Violet Hilton, who were conjoined twins. They were white women with long hair. They were very feminine. They were billed as, and they sang and they danced. They were great performers, and they were pretty. And so they traveled the world. They were famous. I mean, their lives didn't end. The story is sad. It didn't end up great. But at their peak, they were famous. Kind of the same thing for Millie Christine, who they were born enslaved. They were black girls, also a pair of conjoined twins, and they were known as this. I was like, the Twin Nightingale, something like that. Mm-hmm. Beautiful voice. They were very pretty. They also toured, had a great career. But then there were other cases of conjoined twins that, would be found and kind of introduced in this environment, whether or not they wanted to be there. But if they weren't as pretty, or if they weren't able to sing, if they were not able to perform femininity in the right way or perform desirability in the right way, you don't hear about them. I remember reading, there's a really great biography of Daisy and Violet Hilton. I can't remember the author's name, my bad. But if you look it up, it's like the first one that comes up. And he talks about this pair of Hungarian twins that were sort of set up as almost rivals to Daisy and Violet. But these women were not conventionally attractive. They're kind of pitted against one another, but they didn't have that kind of edge. And so we don't know their names. We don't have, there's not posters of them you can buy on Amazon. So it just shows how many different layers go into who's successful and who's forgotten.
And obviously, like, we're both metalheads as well. And like, when you think about someone like Just Merrick, immortalized in, Mastodon's great song, but he is kind of the epitome of the sideshow at the time. Like, someone who his, ailment got worse and worse over time, and got to the point where it was really at that cross section where sideshows are being presented as a scientific inquiry as well as entertainment, and also he was treated as like a scientific, specimen in terms of like people trying to understand what was wrong with him. And, unfortunately, died in pain in a hospital quite young. And I think it is kind of a real encapsulation of, because I've read a lot of stuff in the researching it, of people involved in the business, talking about him and talking like very empathetically about him as a person, and then reading reports about him in newspapers and scientific inquiry, and no one talks about him as a person. It's all about his body and what's wrong with him.
So dehumanizing. That's, one of my little pandemic hobbies earlier, but in between writing my book and losing my mind, was I decided to search out autobiographies and biographies too, but specifically autobiographies from sideshow freaks of old, from performers of old. And I found some. I found a pamphlet that Daisy and Violet wrote to describe themselves. It's actually a source in that book that I mentioned. And I'm so interested in finding people's words describing themselves. I found Lavinia Warren's autobiography, she became famous being married to Tom Thumb, but she had a rich internal life. She was a person. We're people. And I'd love to find more of those, because that is the thing, right? When you look different to the point where, 100 years ago, you can make your living by exhibiting yourself, by just walking out and being like, well, I'm different. Give me some money for it, I guess, because nobody will hire me in a different occupation. Like, I think even just in terms of the marketing and the banners, the way people were presented, like the alligator girl or the what is it, the way that the woman named Crow, who I think she was Indonesian and she had a distinct appearance, and the way that she was marketed, the way that the banners sort of sexualized and changed the way people appeared and made everyone look like a babe or like a super scary monster when it was just a guy or just a woman or just a person who happened to be born a little bit different or a lot different. And like the weird scientific racism of it all and like the eugenics undercurrent, all of I think it's the most interesting thing in the world. And just being able to be part of it a little bit in a modern sense and being able to look into that history and see how it applies now and see the discussions and see how it fits into modern disability liberation and disability politics. I think it's so cool that we're still around.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Even if things have changed, even if it's different, especially post World War I, when being disfigured or being deformed what kind of lost its sheen because so many soldiers and people came back from the war different.
Yeah.
Changed. Like that's when plastic surgery began generally. Well, I'm sure it went back a lot further, but what we know is the modern industry of plastic surgery arose because so many soldiers were coming home with like their eyes blown off or their chins missing or missing arms. Like it's interesting just thinking about the way that who counts as a freak has changed over the years, but what still counts. Like some of the people I know who perform in the Sideshow now could go back 100 years and get the same job because of who they are.
And I think as well, we would be remiss to say if we're talking about labor relations in terms of the Sideshow, and your main work is as a labor journalist as well. You can't come on a podcast and not plug your work. So you have a fantastic book called Fight Like Hell.
The Untold History of American Labor. Yeah, its birthday is this week.
Oh.
It came out a year ago this week. And I'm doing a little, if you're in London and if you hear this before Saturday, I'm doing an event at the Clapton Clubhouse with my friends in Donray. They're doing an acoustic gig. You should come. It'll be cool. But yeah, I wrote a whole book. It's I wrote a whole book. It's a big book. I wrote it in 2020 and 2021 when the world was even weirder. And yeah, it's basically a people's history, like a marginalized people's history of labor in the USA. So it focuses mostly on women and Black and brown workers, Indigenous workers, Asian workers, queer and trans workers, sex workers, disabled workers, and incarcerated workers, the folks that tend to get left out of the mainstream conversations around labor. And yeah, there is a little section on Sideshow, and some people did pick up on it or like, what's this about? This is not something that I'd seen in this context before, because I think there's such a siloing out of different identities and issues. I think, there's the civil rights movement, and there's the women's rights movement, the queer and trans liberation, there's the disability rights movement, there's labor movement. But so many of the same people have been involved in all of those.
It's like a nexus of everything coming together.
It is. Whatever your identity is, whatever your background is, if you go to a protest for a certain issue, you're probably still going to work on Monday, right? So you're part of the labor movement too, especially if you try and organize and bring some of that energy to the job. And writing about like that disabled chapter meant so much to me because not only did I get to write about the Sideshow, but I tried to mix it up a little bit and kind of play with people's perceptions of what labor is. So I also wrote about coal miners disabled with black lung and the wildcat strikes they led in the 60s in West Virginia to get benefits. I wrote about those soldiers coming home and the early disabled rights organizations that they founded. I wrote about how the Black Panthers helped a group of disabled activists occupy a bunch of federal buildings for a month in San Francisco. Like there's all those intersections are just so interesting and feel so relevant to me now because it's all been connected the whole time. We can't talk about Sarah Bartman without talking about racism, misogynoir, and colonialism and all these other problems. And we also can't talk about the Sideshow in general without getting into it. But we also, but the solidarity that was there among those workers too, like we mentioned with Freaks, like we mentioned before, that was part of it too. It's just emphasizing the human parts of all of it. It's easy to get lost in, okay, this is in history, this is a political thing. Like, no, it's always been people, whether or not other folks recognized us as such, right? Like, I think I've only been a person for 100 years.
Exactly.
Oh, that's weird to think about.
And if that sounds very interesting to you, you can find Fight Like Hell by Kim Kelly in any good independent bookstore. Do not buy it off Amazon. And if you enjoyed this show, you can find more of it on Spotify. You can support us on Patreon for as little as £5 a month. You get episodes like this and early bonus episodes. You get cool stuff. At 100 patrons, you're going to get to decide what tattoo I get, which I feel like is going to be a big mistake. But I want to thank you very much for listening. And before we end off, Kim, where can people find you online?
I'm aggressively online. I'm still on Twitter, which seems like a worse idea every day, but I'm at Grim Kim because that was my college radio DJ name and I'm sticking with it. I have a Patreon too, where I post all my work and sometimes exclusive stuff. You can find that linked on Twitter. And also, I'm a freelancer, so I write all over the place. I write for Teen Vogue and Fast Company and kind of whoever will have me, really. And yeah, it's a little harder to find my book in the UK, but the internet, I know y'all get the internet here, so it is not impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And if you would like to talk to your local independent bookseller and ask them to order it for you, I bet they would love to.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, just Google me.
Yep. And just as a final note, join a union. Thank you very much. Goodbye.